that he was in the airport, right?
Okay.
I mean, imagine that shit,
right? I like that.
I would know shit when you land.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's that deep, right?
Yeah.
A long story short, right? Long story short, he pursued his situation, right? And he was in the Ritz-Carlton, from what I hear. And it didn't go well for him because he didn't do shit protocol-wise. Wow. That's all I want to say about it.
They say in Houston, nothing happens by accident. Every move, every arrival, every celebrity that steps into that city is already known before they even land. And what happened to 50 Cent is now becoming one of the most controversial stories in hip-hop history. Because according to Street Talk, when 50 Cent arrived in Houston, he didn't follow the so-called check-in protocol, the unwritten rule that every major artist is expected to respect. No call was made. No message was sent. No connection established with the city's inner network. And that's where everything allegedly shifted. Houston isn't just another rap city. It's a place where influence runs deeper than charts, fame, or money. And at the center of that system is a name that always comes up in these conversations, J. Prince. People claim there's an invisible structure in the city, a code of respect that decides how safely you move once you arrive. And when that code is ignored, consequences follow. What makes this story even more shocking is what reportedly happened next. A situation involving security, timing, and a moment that turned into a warning heard across the entire industry. Some call it a misunderstanding. Others call it street politics. And some believe it's a lesson the rap world was never supposed to ignore. But here's the real question. Was this just another exaggerated hip-hop rumor spreading online? Or did Houston really remind one of the biggest names in rap that no level of fame makes you untouchable in a city with its own rules? Because once you understand how deep this system goes, you start to realize this was never just about one visit. This was about power, respect, and what happens when they collide in the wrong city. And the full story changes everything. Because once you start digging into this story, you realize it's not just about one artist stepping into a city. It's about a system, a culture, and a reputation that has been built over decades. After the moment 50 Cent landed in Houston, the narrative around him didn't stay quiet for long. Online conversations started to explode, with people breaking down what they believe is an unwritten rule that exists in certain major cities, especially Houston. And at the center of that discussion is the idea of checking in. According to street narratives and interviews that have circulated over the years, the concept of checking in is not an official law, but more of an informal expectation in certain circles. It's described as a way of acknowledging local influence, making contact with key figures, and ensuring awareness when high-profile individuals enter a city. In this story, Houston is often portrayed as a place where this idea carries more weight than anywhere else. And the name most often linked to that conversation is J. Prince, a figure widely described in hip-hop culture as having deep influence in both business and street-level networks. Supporters of this idea say it's about respect and structure. Critics say it's outdated or exaggerated. But regardless of opinion, the discussion itself has become part of hip-hop mythology. Now, when people talk about 50 Cent entering Houston, the story becomes even more controversial. Because according to the narrative being spread, he did not follow what some call the expected protocol. No communication. No advance notice. No established connection with the local network, at least according to the claims circulating online. And this is where the story starts to split into two completely different interpretations. One side says it's simply a misunderstanding amplified by social media. The other side believes it's a real example of how local influence still plays a role in certain cities. But what makes this situation viral is not just what people claim happened. It's what people believe it represents. A clash between global fame and local authority, between independence and structure, between celebrity status and street reputation. In hip-hop culture, 50 Cent has always been known for one thing: fearlessness. From his rise in New York to his survival story that became part of his identity, he built a reputation around not backing down from anyone. That image made him one of the most powerful voices in rap. But in this narrative, Houston is being described differently. Not as a place where fame automatically protects you, but as a place where local rules and relationships still matter. And that contrast is what fuels the entire discussion. Because if even one part of the story is true, even partially, then it challenges the way people think about power in the music industry. Not just who is famous, but who controls the environment you step into. As the conversation spreads online, more voices begin adding their interpretations. Some say the idea of check-in culture is simply respect between artists and cities. Others argue it creates unnecessary pressure and fear around travel. And then there are those who believe it is just another layer of hip-hop storytelling, where truth and myth often blend together. But regardless of where someone stands, one thing is clear: the story has captured attention because it feels bigger than just one incident. It feels like a glimpse into how the industry really works behind the scenes. And that is why it continues to circulate across platforms, podcasts, and interviews. Because in hip-hop, perception often becomes reality. And once a narrative gains momentum, it becomes part of culture, whether officially confirmed or not. Now, as this discussion continues to grow, more questions start to emerge. Was this really about protocol? Or was it simply a case of online exaggeration turning into legend? And more importantly, why does this story resonate so strongly with fans who weren't even there? To understand that, you have to go deeper into the history of Houston's music ecosystem and the role certain figures have played in shaping it over the years. Because this is not just about one visit. It's about an entire system of influence that has been talked about, debated, and analyzed for decades. As the conversation around Houston, respect, and the so-called check-in culture continues to grow, the story begins to shift from one single incident into something much larger. Because once Part 1 established the idea of an unwritten system, Part 2 dives deeper into how that system is perceived by the public and why it keeps resurfacing every time a major artist is involved. In these discussions, the name J. Prince is repeatedly mentioned as a central figure in Houston's cultural and industry landscape. And whether people agree or disagree with the narratives surrounding him, one fact remains clear: his influence in hip-hop conversations is undeniable. Supporters of the Houston Code theory argue that cities with strong local ecosystems naturally develop informal rules, ways of acknowledging presence, building relationships, and avoiding unnecessary conflict. They say it is not about control, but about awareness. In this interpretation, when a major figure like 50 Cent enters a city, the expectation is simple: communication and respect between networks. Not necessarily public attention, but private acknowledgement. However, critics of this idea see it very differently. They argue that modern hip-hop is global now, not territorial like it once was. Artists travel freely, perform worldwide, and operate under security teams that already handle logistics and safety. So in their view, the concept of checking in has become outdated, misunderstood, or exaggerated through online storytelling. But what makes this situation viral is not the debate itself. It's the mystery around what people believe happens when the rule is ignored. Online discussions often describe Houston as a place where information travels fast. According to these narratives, word spreads quickly when a high-profile figure arrives in the city, especially within entertainment and social circles. Some claim this creates an environment where awareness is immediate and reactions are swift. But again, these are interpretations shared across media platforms, not confirmed events. Still, the story gains traction because it connects to a deeper psychological theme in hip-hop culture: backhand index pointing. Right, what happens when global fame meets local structure? 50 Cent has always represented independence in rap culture. From his early rise to becoming a major business figure, he built his identity on control, resilience, and not adapting to external pressure. That image is why his name often appears in discussions about authority and power dynamics within the industry. But in this narrative, Houston is framed as a place where no one's reputation automatically overrides local understanding. And that contrast creates tension in the storytelling, because fans begin imagining a scenario where even the biggest names in music must still navigate invisible rules when entering certain environments. As the story spreads, another layer enters the conversation, the idea of message culture. This refers to how stories, warnings, or lessons are believed to circulate through industry circles without direct public statements. Some believe this is how influence is maintained, not through open confrontation, but through reputation, awareness, and example. However, again, this is part of online interpretation and cultural storytelling, not verified fact. What is undeniable, though, is how quickly this narrative evolved from a small discussion into a full-blown internet debate. Podcasts, comment sections, reaction videos all began analyzing the same question from different angles. Was this about respect? Was it about misunderstanding? Or was it simply another example of how hip-hop culture turns ambiguity into mythology? As the conversation deepens, the focus shifts away from individuals and more toward systems. Systems of influence, systems of reputation, systems of perception. And this is where the story becomes less about one event and more about how modern hip-hop interprets power. Because in today's digital world, a single narrative can evolve rapidly, shaped by opinions, commentary, and repetition across platforms. And once a story reaches that level, it no longer belongs to one source. It becomes collective interpretation. That is why this situation continues to trend. Not because everything is confirmed, but because the idea behind it is powerful enough to keep people engaged. And as more voices add their perspective, the line between fact and narrative becomes even thinner. Some see it as respect culture. Some see it as intimidation theory. Others see it as internet exaggeration built on fragments of truth. But all sides agree on one thing. This story reflects a deeper tension in hip-hop between global fame and local influence, between independence and structure, between perception and reality. And that is why it continues to spread. Because in hip-hop, stories don't just end when the moment passes. They evolve. They grow. And sometimes, they become bigger than the event that started them. And as we move into the final breakdown, the question remains, is this really about Houston, or is it about how the entire industry defines respect in 2026? As this entire conversation reaches its final stage, one thing becomes very clear. This was never just about one visit to Houston. It was never just about one artist, one reaction, or one rumored incident that spread across the internet. Instead, what we are really looking at is something much deeper, the way modern hip-hop culture turns movement, reputation, and influence into stories that travel faster than facts themselves. And at the center of this discussion once again stands 50 Cent, an artist whose name has been attached to success, controversy, survival, and industry dominance for decades. Alongside him, the conversation repeatedly circles around figures like Jay Prince, whose influence in Houston's music and business ecosystem has become part of hip-hop folklore. But as this story spreads, the important question is no longer what happened. The real question has become, backhand index pointing right, why do stories like this become so powerful in the first place? To understand that, you have to step back from the details and look at the culture itself. Hip-hop has always been built on layers. On one layer, it is music, expression, art, and storytelling. But on another layer, it is reputation, who you are, what you represent, and how people interpret your presence. And on a deeper layer, it is perception, the stories people believe even when they were never in the room. This is where narratives like the Houston discussion gain momentum. Because once a story enters the internet ecosystem, it no longer belongs to a single source. It becomes shaped by commentary, reaction videos, podcasts, and social media interpretation. Each retelling adds emotion. Each explanation adds detail. And slowly, the line between fact and narrative begins to blur. In this case, the idea of checking in becomes the focal point of debate. Some describe it as a form of respect, a way of acknowledging local culture and maintaining smooth interactions when artists travel between cities. Others describe it as outdated thinking, a leftover structure from a different era of hip-hop, when regional boundaries mattered more than they do today. And then there are those who see it as something in between, not a rule, but a tradition that exists in certain spaces, depending on relationships and context. What makes this debate even more interesting is how it connects to identity in hip-hop. Artists like 50 Cent built their careers on independence, on the idea that they are not controlled, not influenced, and not dependent on external validation. That image is part of their brand, part of what makes them respected worldwide. But cities like Houston represent something different in the storytelling of hip-hop culture. They represent localized influence, communities where history, relationships, and legacy carry weight beyond mainstream fame. And when those two ideas collide, global independence versus local influence, that is where narratives are born. Not necessarily truth, not necessarily fiction, but interpretation. As the discussion continues online, it becomes clear that most people are not reacting to a confirmed event. They are reacting to the idea of the event, the possibility of it, the symbolism of it. Because in hip-hop culture, symbolism often matters more than documentation. That is why stories like this spread so quickly. They represent something larger than themselves: power, respect, boundaries, and the invisible structure of the industry. But as we reach the end of this breakdown, it is important to bring everything back into perspective. There is no verified evidence presented in this narrative that confirms the extreme versions of the story circulating online. What exists instead is a combination of industry rumors, cultural interpretation, online storytelling, and long-standing hip-hop mythology, and when all of that mixes together, it creates something powerful enough to trend globally, but also something easy to misinterpret. That is the reality of the modern internet. A story can start as a small discussion and grow into a massive narrative without ever being fully confirmed. And that is exactly why this topic continues to spark debate. Because it forces people to ask uncomfortable questions about how influence really works in entertainment. Is respect universal? Or is it local? Does fame travel everywhere without limits? Or does every city still hold its own invisible rules? There are no simple answers. And maybe that is why this story refuses to disappear. Because it sits right in the middle of hip-hop's biggest contradiction: global fame versus local power, independence versus structure, truth versus narrative. And as long as those contradictions exist in the culture, stories like this will continue to be told, debated, and reshaped over time. And so, the final takeaway is not about confirming any single version of events. It is about understanding how quickly perception becomes reality in the digital era, how fast a conversation can turn into a legend, and how easily a moment can transform into a myth. And that is the real lesson behind this entire discussion. Not just what was said, but how it was heard. Not just what happened, but what people believe could have happened. And in hip-hop culture, sometimes that difference is where the most powerful stories are born. And that brings us to the end of this breakdown. But the conversation around the story is far from over. Because what you just heard isn't just about one artist, one city, or one moment in hip-hop culture. It's about how narratives are created, spread, and interpreted in today's digital world. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this entire discussion is simply exaggerated internet storytelling built on rumors and assumptions? Or do you believe there's actually a deeper layer of industry structure and respect culture that most fans never see? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of topic where opinions matter just as much as the story itself. And be honest. When you first heard this narrative involving 50 Cent and the Houston conversation, did you take it as fact, or did you see it as entertainment and internet interpretation? Because that's the real question behind all of this. Also, do you think figures like J. Prince represent structure and order in hip-hop culture, or are these stories misunderstood and overblown by social media? Let's talk about it. And if you're someone who enjoys deep breakdowns like this, where we don't just react to headlines, but actually analyze the culture behind them, then this is exactly the kind of content you should stay connected with. Backhand index pointing right, hit the like button if you enjoyed this breakdown. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe for more deep dives into hip-hop stories and industry narratives. Backhand index pointing right, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation-style video, because in this world of music, fame, and viral stories, the next narrative is always just one moment away from exploding. And when it does, we'll break it down together.